bell above the pawnshop door rang sharply, and Duke Alistair Whitmore stopped walking, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath him. Through the dusty window, past the shelves of old watches and forgotten silver, he saw a woman standing at the counter, with her back straight and her chin lifted, the way someone stands when they are trying very hard not to break. She wore black, morning black, faded slightly from too many washes. Her gloved hand rested on a small velvet box, and Alistair did not need to see what was inside it to know that whatever it held was something she did not want to sell. He knew that posture. He knew that stubborn tilt of the head. 10 years had passed, and cities had risen and fallen in his memory, and ships had carried him across oceans he no longer remembered the names of, but he knew her instantly. Eleanor. His heart slammed against his ribs so hard he thought the shopkeeper might hear it. He had told himself, over the years, in quiet moments on foreign docks and in cold hotel rooms, that he had let her go, that the ache had faded into something manageable, something he could carry without it showing on his face. He had been wrong. One glimpse of her through a dirty window, and the last 10 years collapsed like paper. He should have walked on. That would have been the simple thing, the safe thing. A duke did not linger outside pawnshops staring at widows. But his feet would not move, and before he could stop himself, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The bell rang again. Eleanor turned, startled by the sound, and for one terrible, beautiful second, her eyes met his. She did not recognize him. Not at first. Why would she? The boy she had loved had been 23, thin from long hours of study, with unruly hair and ink-stained fingers. The man standing before her now was broad-shouldered, dressed in a fine gray coat, his hair neatly trimmed, his face weathered by sun and salt air and years of command. He looked, she thought distantly, like exactly what he was, a duke. "Forgive the intrusion," Alistair said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt. "I did not mean to startle you." "You didn't," Eleanor said, though her hand had tightened slightly around the velvet box. "I was only surprised. This is not usually a place frequented by gentlemen of your evident standing." There was no recognition in her voice. Only polite wariness, the careful tone of a woman who had learned, through hard experience, to be cautious of strangers who noticed her too closely. Alistair's chest ached. She truly did not know him. "I have business nearby," he said, which was a lie, and he was surprised at how easily it came. "I did not expect to find such an elegant customer in a place like this." The shopkeeper, a small round man named Ernest Willoughby, cleared his throat impatiently. "Madam, the brooch. I can offer you £12, not a penny more. The stone is smaller than it appears, and the setting is old." Eleanor's jaw tightened. Alistair watched her glance down at the box, and something in her expression, a flicker of grief, quickly suppressed, told him this was not a simple transaction to her. Whatever was inside that box mattered. £12, she repeated softly, as though testing whether the number might change if she said it aloud. "Take it or leave it," Willoughby said, not unkindly, but without patience either. "I have other customers waiting." Eleanor's shoulders squared. "I'll take it." Something in Alistair rebelled against the words before he understood why. He stepped forward, closer to the counter than was strictly polite. "Might I see the piece in question?" Eleanor turned to him, surprised. "I beg your pardon?" "I have some knowledge of jewelry," Alistair said, which was only partly true. He had, in fact, spent years overseeing shipments of gemstones for his family's trading company, and he did know a fair amount, but that was not the true reason for his interest. "I would hate to see a lady undervalued in a transaction." Willoughby bristled. "Sir, I run an honest shop." "I have no doubt," Alistair said smoothly, though his eyes stayed on Eleanor. "May I?" Eleanor hesitated. Pride warred visibly across her face, the pride of a woman who did not wish to appear as though she needed rescuing, especially not by a stranger, but practicality, or perhaps simple curiosity, won out, and she opened the box. Inside lay a sapphire brooch, small but finely made, the stone a deep, clear blue that seemed to hold its own quiet light even in the dim shop. Alistair recognized the craftsmanship immediately. It was old work, careful work, the kind that jewelers no longer bothered with, because it took too long and cost too much in labor. He also recognized, with a jolt, that it looked remarkably like a piece his own mother had once owned. From the same era, likely the same workshop in Bath that had served half the good families in the county 30 years ago. "This is worth considerably more than £12, Alistair said, looking directly at Willoughby now. "The stone alone, cut in this style, from that period, I would value it closer to 40. Willoughby's face reddened. "Now see here, sir, I run my shop as I see fit. And I am simply offering an opinion," Alistair said pleasantly, though there was steel beneath the pleasantness. "A lady should not be taken advantage of. Perhaps we might find a fairer number." Eleanor stared at him, a strange mixture of gratitude and suspicion crossing her face. She was not a fool. She understood that a well-dressed stranger did not simply wander into a pawn shop and involve himself in a woman's private business without reason. "You are very kind," she said carefully, "but I do not require a champion, sir. I am capable of managing my own affairs." "Of course," Alistair said quickly, sensing he had overstepped. "Forgive me. I only meant to be of use." There was a pause, heavy and uncertain. Willoughby, sensing an opportunity to end the awkward standoff, muttered, £25, final offer." Eleanor's eyes flicked down to the brooch one last time. Alistair watched her throat move as she swallowed, watched her fingers brush once, briefly, over the stone, as though saying goodbye to something precious. He understood, with sudden clarity, that this was not merely a piece of jewelry to her. It was a memory, a last thread connecting her to something, or someone, she had lost. £25, she said quietly. "Thank you." The transaction was completed swiftly. Willoughby counted out the coins with brisk efficiency, and Eleanor slipped them into a small purse that looked, Alistair noted, nearly empty otherwise. She closed the velvet box, now containing nothing, and held it for a moment longer than necessary before setting it down on the counter, as though it were something she could not bring herself to simply hand over. "Thank you for your assistance," she said to Alistair, offering a small, polite nod. "It was unnecessary, but I am grateful nonetheless." "It was my pleasure," Alistair said. And then, because he could not stop himself, because 10 years of silence pressed against his chest like a physical weight, he added, "Might I know the name of the lady I had the honor of assisting?" Eleanor studied him for a moment, weighing whether to answer. Something in his face, some quality she could not quite name, familiar yet unplaceable, made her pause. "Eleanor Hartley," she said finally. "Lady Hartley, though the title means little these days." The name confirmed everything and nothing. Hartley. She had married, then. Of course she had. 10 years was a long time, and he had never truly expected her to wait. Not after what his father had done. Not after the cruel letter that had ended everything between them before it had properly begun. "A pleasure, Lady Hartley," Alistair said, and his voice was carefully even, though inside, something was breaking apart and rebuilding itself at the same time. "I am Alistair Whitmore." He watched her face for the flicker of recognition, the moment the name might land and unlock the past. But nothing happened. Whitmore was a common enough name, and perhaps she had never learned his full name, all those years ago, when they had known each other only as two young people falling in love in secret, meeting in gardens and libraries where no one would think to look. Perhaps, to her, he had only ever been Alistair, a name without a surname, a boy who had promised things he had not been permitted to keep. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, and even that small formality, Mr., not your grace, not any recognition of his rank, struck him with unexpected force. She truly did not know. "I hope you will forgive my forwardness," Alistair said, "but might I offer to see you safely to your carriage? These streets are not always kind to a lady traveling alone." Eleanor's expression shifted, something guarded settling over her features. "I have no carriage, Mr. Whitmore, I walk." The words landed like a small blow. A lady of her former standing, walking through the streets of London alone, having just sold a piece of jewelry that clearly meant something to her, for a sum that would barely cover a month's modest expenses. Alistair felt something cold settle in his stomach, not judgment, but fear. Fear for her, fear of what her life had become while he had been away, building ships and signing contracts, and telling himself he had moved on. "Then allow me to walk with you, at least part of the way," he said. "I would feel better knowing you arrived safely." Eleanor hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and pride, and something else, perhaps loneliness, though she would never have named it that. "Very well," she said at last. "A short way, Mr. Whitmore. I would not wish to trouble you further." They stepped out into the grey London afternoon together, and as they walked, Alistair stole glances at her profile, searching for the girl he had once loved beneath the tired lines around her eyes, the careful stillness of a woman who had learned to hide her feelings behind good manners. She was still beautiful, more beautiful perhaps, in the quiet strength she now carried, the strength of someone who had survived things he could only guess at. He wanted, desperately, to tell her who he truly was, to say, "Eleanor, don't you remember me? Don't you remember the garden at Ashcombe? The letters we wrote, the promises we made, before everything was taken from us?" But something held him back. Not cowardice, he told himself, but caution. She had built a life without him. She had suffered, clearly, and grieved, and survived. If he revealed himself now, too quickly, he risked breaking something fragile before he understood what it had become. So instead, he asked simple questions. About the weather, about whether she had far to walk. Small, safe things, while his mind raced with everything he could not yet say. "Do you have family in London, Lady Hartley?" he asked, as they turned onto a quieter street. "A daughter," Eleanor said, and for the first time, something warm broke through the careful reserve in her voice. "Clara. She is 7, and far too clever for her own good." "She sounds delightful," Alistair said, and meant it. "She is my whole world," Eleanor said simply. And then, as though realizing she had revealed more than intended, she straightened and added, "Forgive me, I do not usually speak so freely with strangers." "There is nothing to forgive," Alistair said. "I find it refreshing, honestly. Most people I encounter measure every word before speaking." Eleanor gave him a small, curious look, as though trying to place something about him that eluded her. "You speak like a man who has spent time among people who do not trust easily." "Perhaps I have," Alistair admitted. They walked in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable, but full of things unsaid. Alistair found himself memorizing the sound of her footsteps, the way she held her shoulders, the small furrow that appeared between her brows when she was thinking. 10 years had not erased these details from wherever he had kept them locked away. They returned to him now, whole and aching. When they reached the edge of a modest street lined with narrow houses, Eleanor stopped. "This is as far as I will trouble you, Mr. Whitmore. I thank you again for your kindness, both in the shop and on the walk." "The pleasure was entirely mine," Alistair said, and bowed slightly, an old habit from a life she knew nothing about. "I hope our paths might cross again, Lady Hartley." Something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps, or the faintest trace of interest, quickly smothered by caution. "Perhaps," she said, non-committally, and turned to walk the rest of the way alone. Alistair stood watching her, until she disappeared around a corner, and only then did he allow himself to breathe fully, the weight of 10 years pressing against his chest, like something both painful and precious. He had found her, Eleanor, widowed, struggling, proud, and utterly unaware of who he truly was. He thought of the empty velvet box on the pawn-shop counter, of the coins she had accepted with such quiet dignity, of the daughter she spoke of with such fierce tenderness. And he thought, too, of his father's cruel words all those years ago, the letters intercepted, the promises broken not by Eleanor's choice, but by circumstances neither of them had controlled. He was no longer that powerless young man, forced to obey his father's demands. His father was gone now, and with him, the obstacles that had once stood between Alistair and everything he had wanted. He was a duke. He had resources, influence, and freedom he had not possessed a decade ago. And he had just found the one thing he had spent 10 years pretending he did not still want. Standing alone on that quiet London street, Alistair Whitmore made a silent vow. He would not approach her as a duke, not yet. He would not overwhelm her with wealth or titles or grand gestures that might frighten her away or make her suspicious of his motives. He would learn who she had become. He would understand what she had survived, and somehow, carefully, patiently, he would find a way back into her life, not as the boy who had failed to keep his promises, but as the man who intended, finally, to keep them. He did not yet know how difficult that path would prove to be. nor how much pride and pain still stood between them. But as he turned to walk back toward his own world of comfort and privilege, leaving behind the narrow street where Eleanor had disappeared, he felt something he had not felt in 10 long years. Hope. And beneath the hope, quiet and steady, a decision already taking root, one that would change both their lives forever, though neither of them yet understood how far that change would reach. Alistair did not sleep that night. He sat by the window of his townhouse on Grosvenor Square, a glass of brandy untouched beside him, watching the gas lamps flicker against the darkened street, and he thought only of Eleanor, of the tired lines around her eyes, of the way she had held that empty velvet box as though it still contained something precious. He had spent 10 years training himself not to think of her, and in a single afternoon, that discipline had shattered completely. By morning, he had made a decision that felt reckless even to him. He would learn everything he could about her circumstances, quietly, carefully, without revealing his true identity or his intentions. He summoned his solicitor, a sharp, discreet man named Edward Pratt, who had handled delicate family matters before and knew when to ask questions and when to simply follow instructions. "I need information," Alistair said, standing at his desk rather than sitting, too restless to remain still. "About a woman named Eleanor Hartley, Lady Hartley, widow of the late Lord Hartley." Pratt raised an eyebrow slightly, but said nothing beyond, "Of course, Your Grace. May I ask the nature of your interest?" "Personal," Alistair said, in a tone that closed the subject. "I want to know her situation, her finances, her circumstances." "Discreetly, Pratt. She must not learn of this inquiry." Pratt bowed his head. "Understood, Your Grace. I shall have preliminary information within the week." The week that followed felt longer than any of the years Alistair had spent overseas. He busied himself with the affairs of his estate, meetings with tenants, correspondence regarding his shipping interests, but his mind kept drifting back to that narrow London street, to the sound of Eleanor's footsteps beside his own. He caught himself, more than once, staring at nothing, remembering the particular way she used to laugh, all those years ago, at Ashcombe, before everything had gone wrong. He remembered the garden clearly, even now. The roses along the stone wall, the little bench beneath the old oak tree where they used to meet in secret, away from prying eyes and disapproving elders. Eleanor had been the daughter of a respectable but modest family, her father a country doctor, her mother long deceased, and though she was educated and gracious and kind in every way that mattered, she had lacked the title and fortune that Alistair's father considered essential for his heir's future wife. Alistair had been 23 then, full of youthful conviction that love could overcome any obstacle, that his father's objections were simply old-fashioned prejudices that time and persistence would wear down. He had been wrong. His father, the previous duke, had been immovable, and when gentle persuasion failed, he had resorted to more ruthless methods. Alistair had been sent abroad, ostensibly to learn the family's shipping business firsthand, but in truth, to separate him from Eleanor long enough for the attachment to fade. Letters were meant to bridge the distance, but Alistair later learned, to his lasting fury, that his father had intercepted every letter Eleanor sent, and likely every letter Alistair himself had written in return. By the time Alistair understood what had happened, years had passed, and Eleanor, believing herself abandoned and forgotten, had accepted the proposal of Lord Hartley, a respectable if unremarkable gentleman, who could offer her security and a stable home. Alistair had learned of her marriage through a brief mention in a letter from his sister, tucked between unrelated family news, as though it were a small matter, rather than the shattering of everything he had once hoped for. He remembered exactly where he had been standing when he read those words, on the deck of a ship bound for Calcutta, the salt wind sharp against his face, and he remembered the strange, hollow feeling that had settled into his chest and never quite left, not in all the years since. He had told himself, over time, that it no longer mattered, that Eleanor had made her choice, or rather, that circumstances had made it for her, and that dwelling on the past served no purpose beyond causing himself unnecessary pain. He had thrown himself into his work, expanded the family's trading interests across 3 continents, and when his father died 2 years ago, he had returned to England to assume the dukedom with a sense of duty rather than joy. He had not expected, in 100 lifetimes, to walk into a pawn shop and find her there. When Pratt returned a week later, with the information Alistair had requested, The news was worse than he had feared. Lord Hartley, it seemed, had left behind considerable debts upon his death. Debts accumulated through poor investments and an unfortunate habit of gambling that he had concealed from his wife until the very end. The Hartley estate, modest to begin with, had been largely consumed by creditors, leaving Eleanor with little beyond a small annuity that barely covered basic necessities. "She lives in rented rooms on Prescott Lane," Pratt said, consulting his notes. "A respectable but humble address. She takes in needlework to supplement her income, and occasionally sells pieces of jewelry, as you witnessed yourself. Her daughter attends a small local school funded partly by charitable contributions. There is no indication of extended family willing or able to assist her further." Alistair listened to this recitation with a growing tightness in his chest. Eleanor, who had once worn silk and danced at country balls, was now stitching hems for pennies to keep a roof over her daughter's head. The thought was unbearable. "Society has largely forgotten her," Pratt continued. "Her late husband's family blames her, unfairly, for his financial decline, though I have found no evidence she had any knowledge of his gambling. She receives few invitations, fewer visits. She is, in essence, alone." "Thank you, Pratt," Alistair said quietly. "That will be all for now." After Pratt left, Alistair remained at his desk for a long time, staring at the notes spread before him, without truly seeing them. Eleanor had been abandoned twice now, once by circumstances that had separated her from him all those years ago, and again by a society quick to judge and slow to forgive. And through it all, she had maintained her dignity, her pride, her fierce love for her daughter. He thought of simply sending her money, anonymously, enough to ease her burdens without revealing his involvement. It would be easy enough to arrange, but something in him resisted the idea. Eleanor was proud. He had seen that clearly in the pawn shop, in her insistence that she required no champion, no rescue. An anonymous gift of money might feel, to a woman like her, like charity, like pity, and he suspected she would refuse it, or worse, feel humiliated by it. No. If he wanted to help her, truly help her, he would need to do so carefully, patiently, in ways that preserved her dignity rather than wounding it further. He decided, that evening, that he would find a reason to encounter her again, not through elaborate schemes or manipulation, but through simple, ordinary means, the kind of coincidences that occur naturally in a city as large as London, if one knows where to look. He learned, through further discreet inquiry, that Eleanor occasionally attended events organized by a charitable society, dedicated to assisting widows of modest means, a group that held regular gatherings to distribute clothing, food, and small stipends to those in need. It was, Alistair thought, a fitting place for their paths to cross again. Not through his wealth or title, but through genuine, shared concern for those who struggled. He arranged, through his own charitable contributions, to attend the Society's upcoming autumn gathering, ostensibly as a patron, interested in expanding his support for their work. It was not entirely a lie. He did intend to support the organization, generously and consistently, regardless of whether Eleanor attended, but he could not deny that the primary motivation for his sudden interest was the hope of seeing her again. The days leading up to the gathering felt interminable. Alistair found himself unusually distracted during meetings with his estate manager, his thoughts wandering to narrow London streets and sapphire brooches, and the particular shade of Eleanor's eyes, which he remembered as somewhere between gray and green, depending on the light. He wondered if she thought of him at all, or if the boy she had once loved had faded entirely from her memory, replaced by grief for the husband she had lost, and worry for the daughter she was raising alone. He wondered, too, whether he was making a terrible mistake. Eleanor had built a life, however difficult, without him. She had grieved a husband, raised a child, survived hardships he could only imagine. What right did he have to insert himself back into her world, stirring up feelings and complications she might not want or need? Perhaps the kindest thing would be to simply help her from a distance, anonymously, and let her continue rebuilding her life without the added burden of a past she might prefer to leave buried. But even as he considered this more cautious path, he knew he could not follow it. He had spent 10 years living with regret, with the ache of a love interrupted before it had the chance to fully bloom. He could not simply walk away again, not now that fate, or chance, or something he could not quite name, had placed her back within his reach. He would proceed carefully. He would let her set the pace, respect her boundaries, never push where he was not welcome. But he would not disappear again. Not this time. On the morning of the charitable gathering, Alistair dressed with more care than he had in years, though he told himself repeatedly that his appearance mattered little, that this was simply a philanthropic engagement like any other. He arrived at the modest hall where the event was held, a converted assembly room near the edge of the city, decorated simply with autumn flowers and long tables laden with donated goods. He scanned the gathering crowd with an intensity he tried to disguise as polite interest in the proceedings, his heart quickening each time a dark-haired woman in mourning black entered his field of vision, only to sink slightly when he realized, again and again, that it was not Eleanor. He was beginning to wonder if she had not come at all, if his careful planning had been for nothing when he saw her. She stood near the far end of the hall, speaking quietly with an elderly woman, while a small girl with dark curls clung to her skirts, peering curiously at the tables of donated clothing and toys. Clara, Alistair realized. Eleanor's daughter. He watched them for a long moment before approaching, taking in the easy tenderness with which Eleanor bent down to answer some question Clara had whispered, the way her whole face softened when she looked at her daughter, transforming briefly from careful composure into something warmer, more unguarded. He crossed the room slowly, giving himself time to steady his nerves, though nothing could have fully prepared him for the moment Eleanor looked up and saw him approaching. Surprise flickered across her face, followed quickly by something more complicated, wariness, perhaps, mixed with the faint pleasure of an unexpected, but not unwelcome encounter. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, straightening, "I did not expect to see you here." "Nor I you, though I confess I am pleased by the coincidence," Alistair said, offering a small bow. "I have recently taken an interest in supporting this society's work." "How generous of you," Eleanor said, though there was a slight edge of curiosity in her tone, as though she suspected there might be more to the story than he was revealing. Clara tugged at her mother's skirt, peering up at Alistair with open, unguarded curiosity. "Mama, who is this?" "This is Mr. Whitmore, my darling," Eleanor said. "He was kind enough to assist me last week." "Are you a prince?" Clara asked bluntly, studying Alistair's fine coat with the frank assessment only a child could manage. Alistair laughed, genuinely delighted by the question. "No, I'm afraid not. Just an ordinary gentleman." "You don't look ordinary," Clara said matter-of-factly, and Eleanor flushed slightly, murmuring an apology for her daughter's frankness, though Alistair only laughed again. "She is perceptive," he said. "You must be very proud." "I am," Eleanor said softly, and for a moment something passed between them, unspoken but powerfully felt. A recognition, perhaps, of the years and hardships that had shaped them both, and the strange, fragile possibility of a new beginning neither of them was quite ready to name. The afternoon continued, with careful, measured conversation, the three of them moving slowly through the hall as volunteers distributed goods to those in need. Alistair found himself charmed entirely by Clara's bright, unfiltered observations about the world, and increasingly, dangerously captivated by Eleanor's quiet strength, the way she managed to remain gracious and warm despite everything she had endured. By the time the gathering drew to a close, Alistair knew, with absolute certainty, that walking away from Eleanor Hartley again was simply not something he was capable of doing. Whatever it took, however long it required, he intended to find his way back into her life, properly this time, without the shadow of his father's cruelty standing between them. As he watched Eleanor and Clara depart into the fading afternoon light, he made a silent promise to himself. He would move carefully, patiently, respectfully, but he would not let her slip away again. Not this time. Eleanor could not stop thinking about Mr. Whitmore for days after the charitable gathering. Though she scolded herself constantly for the indulgence, she had no business dwelling on a stranger's kindness, no matter how genuine it seemed, no matter how strangely familiar something about his manner had felt. She had learned, through hard experience, that kindness from gentlemen of standing often came with unspoken expectations, and she had no intention of placing herself or Clara in a vulnerable position again. And yet, there was something about the way he looked at her, not with pity, which she had grown accustomed to and had learned to despise, but with something closer to recognition, as though he saw not a struggling widow to be pitied, but a woman worth knowing. It unsettled her, this feeling, because it stirred something she had thought long buried, a flicker of hope, fragile and unfamiliar, that perhaps her life was not destined to remain as narrow and difficult as it had become. She busied herself with her needlework that evening, sitting by the small fire in her rented rooms, while Clara slept soundly in the adjoining room. The work was tedious, but necessary, hemming garments for a local seamstress, who paid modestly, but reliably, enough to supplement the small annuity that barely covered rent and food. Eleanor's fingers moved automatically, practiced after 2 years of similar evenings, while her mind wandered back to the afternoon's encounter. She thought, too, of her late husband, Lord Hartley, kind in his own quiet way, though never a man who inspired great passion in her. Their marriage had been one of practicality rather than love, a sensible arrangement between a lonely widower's daughter of modest means and a gentleman seeking a companion for his middle years. She had cared for him, in the manner one cares for a comfortable habit, and had grieved him sincerely when he died, though the grief had been complicated by the discovery of his hidden debts, which had transformed her mourning into something far more desperate. She rarely allowed herself to think of the man she had truly loved, all those years ago, before Lord Hartley, before any of this. That love felt like a different lifetime, belonging to a different Eleanor entirely, younger, more hopeful, before life had taught her the painful lesson that love and security rarely arrived in the same package. His name had been Alistair. She stopped her needlework abruptly, the sudden thought striking her with unexpected force. She had not allowed herself to think that name in years, had trained herself to skip over the memory whenever it threatened to surface, the way one avoids stepping on a wound that has never fully healed. But something about Mr. Whitmore, the careful way he spoke, the particular warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the sense that he was holding something back, some deeper knowledge or feeling he had not yet revealed, had stirred memories she thought she had successfully buried. It was foolish, she told herself firmly. Alistair had been the son of a country gentleman, not a duke's family friend attending charitable functions in fine grey coats. The two men shared nothing beyond a first name that was common enough among gentlemen of a certain generation. She was simply lonely, she reasoned, lonely and vulnerable after years of hardship, and her mind was manufacturing connections that did not truly exist. She resumed her needlework, pushing the thought firmly aside, though it lingered at the edges of her consciousness like smoke that refused to fully clear. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to her rented rooms. Margaret Ellison, an old friend from her days before marriage, one of the few connections from her past, who had not abandoned her after Lord Hartley's death, revealed the family's true financial state. Margaret arrived with a basket of fresh bread and a bundle of second-hand clothing for Clara, gifts offered with the easy generosity of genuine friendship rather than condescending charity. "You look tired, Eleanor," Margaret observed, settling into the small room's single comfortable chair, while Eleanor prepared tea from her modest supply. "More tired than usual, I think." "I am always tired, Margaret," Eleanor said, attempting lightness she did not entirely feel. "It comes with the territory of raising a daughter alone, on very little money." Margaret's expression softened with sympathy, though she was careful, as always, not to let it tip into pity, understanding instinctively that Eleanor could tolerate friendship, but not condescension. "Has something happened? You seem distracted." Eleanor hesitated, uncertain whether to share the strange encounter that had been occupying her thoughts. But Margaret had always been trustworthy, discreet in ways that mattered, and Eleanor found herself, almost without deciding to, recounting the story of the pawn shop, the mysterious gentleman who had intervened on her behalf, and their subsequent encounter at the charitable gathering. Margaret listened with growing interest, her eyebrows rising slightly at certain details. "Whitmore, you said. Alistair Whitmore?" "Yes, why?" Eleanor asked, noticing the sudden shift in her friend's expression. "Eleanor," Margaret said slowly, setting down her teacup, "do you truly not know who that is?" "I know his name, and that he is evidently a gentleman of some means," Eleanor said, confused by Margaret's tone. "Should I know more?" Margaret studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much to reveal. "Alistair Whitmore is the Duke of Ashcombe, Eleanor. He inherited the title 2 years ago, upon his father's death." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The teacup in her hand trembled slightly, and she set it down carefully to avoid spilling its contents. Ashcombe, she repeated softly, the word landing with the weight of a decade's buried memories. Yes, Margaret said gently, watching her friend's reaction with growing concern. Eleanor, is something wrong? You've gone quite pale. Eleanor could not immediately answer. Ashcombe, the estate where she had spent her happiest summer, all those years ago, meeting secretly with a young man named Alistair, beneath the old oak tree in the garden, exchanging promises neither of them had been permitted to keep. She had known, vaguely, that Alistair's family held some title, though he had never spoken much of it during their brief courtship, and she had been too young and too infatuated to ask the sort of practical questions a more cautious woman might have posed. She had not known, could not have known, that the boy she had loved and lost was the very same man who had walked into that pawn shop and offered his assistance with such careful, deliberate kindness. Eleanor, Margaret said again, more insistently this time. What is it? I knew him, Eleanor said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Years ago, before Lord Hartley, before any of this, I knew a young man named Alistair at Ashcombe, though I never understood the full extent of his family's position. We cared for each other, deeply, but circumstances separated us, and I believed, for many years, that he had simply lost interest, or perhaps that his family had found the connection unsuitable and pressed him to end it. Margaret's eyes widened with understanding. And you believe this is the same man? I do not know, Eleanor said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew, with growing certainty, that it was true. The careful way he had watched her in the pawn shop, the warmth in his eyes that seemed to carry recognition rather than simple politeness, the strange, persistent sense of familiarity she had dismissed as foolish sentiment, it all made sense now, in a way that left her feeling simultaneously breathless and furious. If it is truly him, Eleanor said slowly, anger beginning to rise beneath the shock, then he has known who I am from the very beginning, and he chose not to tell me. He allowed me to believe we were meeting as strangers, when in fact... She stopped, unable to finish the thought, her mind racing through the implications. Had he sought her out deliberately? Had their encounter at the pawn shop been a coincidence at all, or had he somehow arranged it, watching her from a distance before making his approach? The thought made her feel exposed, manipulated, though she could not entirely reconcile this suspicion with the genuine warmth she had sensed in his manner. Perhaps he did not recognize you at first, Margaret suggested gently. 10 years is a long time, Eleanor, and grief and hardship change a person's appearance considerably. Perhaps he only realized who you were, partway through your encounter, and did not know how to reveal it without causing distress. Or perhaps, Eleanor said, her voice hardening with old, familiar pain, he knew all along, and chose to observe me struggling, chose to watch me sell my last remaining pieces of jewelry, before deciding whether I was worth acknowledging. That seems unlikely, given what you've described of his behavior, Margaret said carefully. A man seeking only to observe and judge would hardly involve himself so directly in your transaction, nor would he seek out further occasions to encounter you. Eleanor knew Margaret's logic was sound, but the old wound, reopened so suddenly and unexpectedly, made rational thought difficult. She remembered, with painful clarity, the months following Alistair's departure for his family's overseas business interests. The letters she had written faithfully, pouring her heart onto pages that seemingly vanished into silence. She remembered the growing despair as weeks turned to months without response, the eventual, devastating conclusion that he had simply moved on, that whatever he had felt for her had not survived the distance and time. She remembered, too, the humiliation of continuing to hope, long after any reasonable person would have accepted the truth, checking for letters that never arrived, defending his memory to her own doubts, long past the point of dignity. Eventually, she had forced herself to let go, to accept Lord Hartley's proposal, not out of love, but out of practical necessity, and a weary desire to stop hoping for something that clearly was not coming. If Alistair had truly loved her as deeply as she had once believed, why had he never written? Why had a decade passed in silence, only for him to reappear now, offering careful kindness in a pawn shop, as though nothing had happened between them? I need time to think, Eleanor said finally, standing abruptly, and moving to the small window that overlooked the narrow street below. This is a great deal to absorb, Margaret." "Of course," Margaret said, rising as well, understanding her friend needed solitude. "But Eleanor, whatever the truth of this situation, please consider approaching it with caution rather than assumption. There may be explanations you have not yet considered." Eleanor nodded, though her mind remained a tangle of confusion, anger, and something else, something she was reluctant to name, a fragile, dangerous hope that perhaps the man she had loved had not, after all, abandoned her willingly. After Margaret departed, Eleanor sat alone in the gathering darkness of her small room, watching Clara sleep peacefully in the adjoining space, and allowed herself, for the first time in years, to fully remember Alistair as he had been at 23, earnest, passionate, full of plans for a future they would build together, plans that had been shattered so completely she had spent a decade believing they had never truly mattered to him at all. If he was truly the Duke of Ashcombe, if he had truly recognized her from their very first encounter in that pawn shop, then Eleanor understood she faced a choice far more complicated than she had initially realized. She could confront him directly, demand explanations for the silence that had defined the past decade of her life. She could withdraw entirely, protecting herself and Clara from further complications by avoiding any future encounters. Or she could wait, cautiously, to see what he intended, what explanations he might offer, and whether the man he had become bore any resemblance to the boy she had once loved with her whole young heart. She did not yet know which path she would choose, but she knew, with growing certainty, that their next encounter would not be as simple or as comfortable as their previous meetings had been. Too much had been revealed, too many old wounds reopened, for either of them to continue pretending they were merely strangers, kind to one another by chance. Somewhere across the city, in his grand townhouse on Grosvenor Square, Alistair remained blissfully unaware that his careful secret had already been discovered, that the woman he had spent 10 years silently loving now knew exactly who he was, and carried within her a decade's worth of unanswered questions that would soon demand answers he was not entirely certain he was prepared to give. A note arrived at Alistair's townhouse 3 days later, delivered by a young messenger boy who waited, hat in hand, for a response. Alistair recognized the careful, elegant handwriting on the envelope immediately, though he had not seen it in 10 years, and his hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. The note was brief. Eleanor requested the pleasure of his company at her rented rooms on Prescott Lane the following afternoon, at 3 o'clock, to discuss a matter of some importance. The formality of the language did nothing to disguise the underlying tension Alistair sensed in every carefully chosen word. She knew, he was certain of it, the moment he finished reading. He spent that night composing and discarding a dozen different explanations, rehearsing words that felt inadequate the moment he spoke them aloud to his empty study. How did one explain 10 years of silence that had never truly been silence at all, but rather a cruel deception orchestrated by a father now beyond the reach of Eleanor's justified anger? How did one apologize for a wound, inflicted not by his own hand, but by circumstances he had been too young and too powerless to overcome? He arrived at Prescott Lane the following afternoon, precisely on time, his heart pounding with a nervousness he had not experienced since his earliest days commanding negotiations for his family's shipping interests. The building was modest but respectable, and he climbed the narrow staircase to Eleanor's rooms, with a growing sense of dread mixed with desperate hope. Eleanor opened the door herself, Clara nowhere in sight, presumably sent to a neighbor or occupied elsewhere for the duration of this conversation. Her face was composed, carefully neutral, though Alistair could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the way her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping aside to allow him entry. "Please, sit." The room was small but tidy, furnished simply with well-worn but carefully maintained furniture. Alistair sat where she indicated, watching as she remained standing, choosing instead to pace slowly before the small fireplace, gathering her thoughts. "I know who you are," she said finally, turning to face him directly. "The Duke of Ashcombe, Alistair Whitmore, of Ashcombe Hall." There it was, the truth, spoken plainly, hanging in the air between them. "Yes," Alistair said quietly, seeing no purpose in denial. "I should have told you sooner. I apologize for the deception, though I never intended it as cruelty." "Did you know who I was?" That day in the pawn shop? Eleanor asked, her voice tight, with barely controlled emotion. From the very first moment? Yes, Alistair admitted. I recognized you instantly. Eleanor's composure cracked slightly, her eyes bright with unshed tears and fierce anger in equal measure. 10 years, Alistair. 10 years of silence, and you simply walked into that shop and said nothing? Watched me sell my jewelry, watched me struggle, and said nothing about who you truly were? I did not know how to tell you, Alistair said, standing now, needing to explain properly, to make her understand. I feared that revealing my identity too quickly would frighten you away, or worse, that you would believe I had come only out of pity, or some sense of noble obligation, rather than genuine feeling. And what was I meant to believe instead? Eleanor demanded. That a mysterious stranger simply happened to involve himself in my affairs, happened to attend the very charitable function I frequent, purely by coincidence? Alistair had no adequate answer for this, and his silence seemed to confirm her growing suspicion that his intentions, however well-meaning, had been calculated rather than spontaneous. Eleanor, he said finally, I never stopped thinking of you. Not for a single day in the past 10 years. When I saw you in that shop, selling that brooch, I could not simply walk away and pretend I had not recognized the woman I once loved. Loved, Eleanor repeated bitterly. If you loved me, Alistair, why did you never write? Why did 10 years pass in complete silence, until you found me by chance, wealthy and comfortable in your fine gray coat, while I sold the last remnants of my dignity to keep my daughter fed? I did write, Alistair said, desperation creeping into his voice now. Eleanor, I wrote to you constantly, every week, sometimes more often. For the entire first year I was abroad. I never received a single response, and I believed eventually that your silence meant you had chosen to move forward without me, that perhaps my father's disapproval of our match had convinced you the connection was not worth pursuing. Eleanor stared at him, confusion mixing with her anger. I never received any letters from you, Alistair. Not one, in all those years. I wrote to you faithfully, for nearly 8 months before finally accepting that you had simply stopped caring. The two of them stood in silence for a long moment, the terrible truth beginning to dawn on both of them simultaneously. My father, Alistair said slowly, horror creeping into his voice, as pieces he had never fully examined began falling into place. He must have intercepted our correspondence. Both directions. He never approved of you, Eleanor. Considered our match entirely unsuitable, given your family's more modest circumstances. I always suspected he had discouraged the connection through pressure and manipulation, but I never imagined he would resort to something so deliberately cruel as destroying our letters. You believe your own father would do such a thing? Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to accept this explanation, however painful, as more plausible than the alternative she had been nursing for a decade. I know he was capable of it, Alistair said grimly. He controlled every aspect of my life during those years, dictated my education, my business dealings, even my personal correspondence when it suited his purposes. It would not have been difficult for him to ensure that letters between us never reached their intended destination. Eleanor sank slowly into a nearby chair, the fight draining out of her as the full weight of this revelation settled over her. 10 years, she said softly, more to herself than to Alistair. 10 years I believed you had abandoned me, that whatever we shared meant nothing to you beyond a passing youthful infatuation. I built an entire life around that belief, Alistair. I married Lord Hartley because I had given up hope of ever finding genuine affection again. I am so sorry, Alistair said, kneeling now before her chair, needing her to understand the depth of his regret. I should have fought harder, should have questioned the silence more thoroughly, rather than simply accepting my father's assurances that you had moved on and found happiness elsewhere. I was young, and perhaps too willing to believe what was easiest to accept, rather than confronting the possibility that my own father had betrayed us both so completely. Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of deception, any sign that his explanation was merely convenient rather than truthful. But she saw only genuine anguish, the same earnest passion she remembered from their youth, tempered now by years of hardship and responsibility, that had clearly shaped him into a more thoughtful, careful man than the impulsive young lover she had once known. I do not know what to believe, she said finally, exhaustion evident in her voice. This is a great deal to absorb, Alistair. A decade of grief and hardship, and now you tell me it was all built upon a foundation of your father's cruelty, rather than any failing on your part. I understand if you require time, Alistair said gently, rising from his kneeling position but remaining close, unwilling to retreat entirely from the fragile connection reforming between them. I do not expect forgiveness, nor do I expect you to simply accept my explanation without question. But I needed you to know the truth, Eleanor. I needed you to understand that my silence was never a choice I made willingly. Eleanor nodded slowly, though her expression remained troubled, torn between the desire to believe him and the protective caution she had cultivated through years of disappointment and betrayal. I appreciate your honesty, she said carefully. But Alistair, even if what you say is true, even if your father truly did intercept our letters, a great deal has changed in 10 years. I am no longer the young woman you once knew. I have a daughter now. Responsibilities and complications you cannot simply erase with an explanation, however sincere. I do not wish to erase anything, Alistair said firmly. I wish only to understand who you have become, to know your daughter, to rebuild whatever connection remains possible between us, without pressure or expectation. I am not asking you to simply resume where we left off 10 years ago. I am asking only for the opportunity to know you again, properly, as the people we have become. Eleanor considered this for a long moment, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities and lingering uncertainty. I need time, she said finally. Time to process everything you have told me, time to decide what, if anything, I am prepared to offer in return. That is entirely fair, Alistair said, though disappointment flickered briefly across his features before he carefully composed himself. I will not press you further than you are willing to go, Eleanor. Take whatever time you require. He took his leave shortly after, the conversation having exhausted them both emotionally, leaving behind more questions than answers, though the foundation of truth had shifted something fundamental between them. As Alistair descended the narrow staircase and stepped back into the London afternoon, he felt a strange mixture of relief and continued uncertainty. Relief that the truth was finally spoken aloud. Uncertainty about whether that truth would be enough to overcome 10 years of accumulated pain and disappointment. Eleanor, alone once more in her small rooms, sat for a long time staring into the fire, turning over every word of their conversation, searching for certainty that remained frustratingly elusive. Could she truly believe that a father's cruelty, rather than a lover's indifference, had shaped the course of her entire adult life? And if she did believe it, what did that mean for the careful, protective walls she had built around her heart in the years since? Walls that had kept her safe, but also profoundly, achingly alone. She did not yet know the answer, but for the first time in a decade, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that the life she had built, however difficult, however marked by loss and hardship, might not be the only path remaining open to her. Weeks passed slowly after that difficult conversation. Weeks during which Alistair kept his promise to give Eleanor the space she had requested, though the restraint cost him more than he cared to admit. He busied himself with estate matters, with expanding his charitable contributions to the Widows' Society, and with a growing determination to help Eleanor in ways that would not wound her pride or feel like unwelcome charity. He learned, through careful conversation with Margaret Ellison, who had become an unexpected ally in his efforts to understand Eleanor's circumstances, that her late husband's former steward, a capable but currently unemployed man named William Foxworth, had struggled to find suitable work since Lord Hartley's death and the dissolution of the estate. Alistair arranged, through an intermediary, to offer Foxworth a position managing one of his own smaller properties, a legitimate opportunity that had nothing directly to do with Eleanor, though he knew the man's employment would ease certain burdens on her conscience, given her sense of responsibility toward those who had served her late husband faithfully. He also learned that the charitable society Eleanor volunteered with was struggling to secure adequate funding for the coming winter season, when the needs of London's widows and orphans grew most acute. Alistair arranged an anonymous donation, substantial enough to ensure the society could expand its winter relief efforts significantly, careful to route the contribution through channels that would not reveal his identity as the source. He told himself these efforts were separate from his feelings for Eleanor, genuine attempts to address real needs he had become aware of through his renewed connection to her world. But he knew, in his more honest moments, that every action was ultimately motivated by his desire to ease her burdens, to demonstrate, however indirectly, that his feelings extended beyond words into meaningful action. Eleanor, for her part, spent those same weeks in a state of cautious contemplation, turning over the revelations of their conversation again and again, testing them against her memories of the young man she had once loved and the accumulated wisdom of 10 difficult years. She found herself, despite her best efforts at restraint, softening gradually toward the possibility that Alistair's explanation was genuine, that his father's cruelty, rather than his own indifference, had shaped the painful course of her adult life. She did not see Alistair during those weeks, having made clear her need for space, but she heard of him occasionally through Margaret, who seemed to have developed an unusual interest in reporting his various activities and charitable endeavors. Eleanor suspected, though she could not prove it, that Alistair's hand lay behind several fortunate developments within the Widows' Society, and behind William Foxworth's sudden and welcome employment, though he had made no direct claim to these interventions. The suspicion troubled her, not because she doubted his good intentions, but because she recognized in his careful, indirect kindness the same pattern that had once characterized his youthful courtship: thoughtful, generous, always careful not to overwhelm or presume too much. It was, she admitted reluctantly to herself, precisely the sort of behavior that had first drawn her to him all those years ago, and precisely the sort of behavior that made resisting her renewed feelings increasingly difficult. One afternoon, nearly a month after their difficult conversation, Eleanor received an unexpected visit from William Foxworth himself, arriving at her rented rooms with profuse gratitude and news of his new position, managing a property for an unnamed benefactor. Eleanor listened to his account with growing suspicion, recognizing immediately the careful anonymity that suggested Alistair's involvement, though Foxworth himself seemed genuinely unaware of his benefactor's true identity. "I cannot thank you enough for whatever influence you must have exercised on my behalf, my lady," Foxworth said earnestly, hat clutched in his weathered hands. "I had nearly given up hope of finding suitable employment, given the circumstances surrounding Lord Hartley's estate. I assure you, Mr. Foxworth, I exercised no influence whatsoever," Eleanor said honestly, though her mind raced with confirmation of her suspicions. "I am pleased to hear of your good fortune, but the credit belongs elsewhere." After Foxworth departed, Eleanor sat for a long time, considering this latest evidence of Alistair's continued, careful attention to her welfare, even while respecting the boundaries she had established between them. It would have been easy, she realized, for him to simply present these gifts directly, to claim credit, and perhaps expect gratitude or obligation in return. Instead, he had worked quietly, anonymously, seeking nothing beyond the genuine easing of burdens that weighed upon those she cared about. She found herself, against her better judgment, wanting to see him again. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected, when Clara, playing in the small courtyard behind their building with several neighborhood children, took an unfortunate tumble and scraped her knee badly enough to require proper medical attention. Eleanor, lacking funds for a physician's visit beyond the most basic remedies, found herself increasingly anxious as the wound showed signs of infection over the following days, Clara's fever rising alongside her mother's growing panic. In her desperation, without fully considering the implications, Eleanor sent a brief note to Alistair's townhouse, requesting his assistance in securing proper medical care for her daughter, setting aside pride in favor of Clara's welfare. Alistair arrived within the hour, having secured the services of a respected physician, known for his skill and discretion, and the two of them spent an anxious evening together at Clara's bedside, watching as the physician cleaned and properly dressed the wound, administering medicine to reduce the fever that had frightened Eleanor so thoroughly. "She will recover fully," the physician assured them both, packing away his instruments. "The infection was caught in time, though I would recommend close observation for the next several days to ensure no complications arise." After the physician departed, Alistair and Eleanor remained together in the small room, watching Clara sleep peacefully now, her fever already beginning to break under the medicine's influence. The crisis had stripped away some of the careful distance Eleanor had maintained over the previous weeks, leaving behind a raw vulnerability that neither of them attempted to disguise. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, watching her daughter sleep. I do not know what I would have done without your assistance tonight." "You would have found a way," Alistair said gently. "You are remarkably resourceful, Eleanor. I have watched you navigate circumstances that would break lesser spirits, and you have done so with grace and determination that continues to astonish me." Eleanor turned to look at him properly for the first time that evening, seeing in his tired, concerned expression genuine care that extended beyond mere obligation or lingering guilt. "You have been helping me, haven't you? Foxworth's position, the Society's sudden good fortune with funding, these were not simply coincidences." Alistair hesitated, then nodded, seeing no purpose in further denial. "I wanted to ease your burdens, Eleanor, in whatever small ways I could manage, without overstepping the boundaries you established. I understood you did not wish for direct charity, so I sought other avenues that might help without wounding your pride." "Why?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Why continue such efforts, when I gave you no encouragement, no indication that my feelings toward you had softened?" "Because I love you," Alistair said simply, the words landing with quiet, undeniable weight. "I have loved you for 10 years, Eleanor, through silence and separation, and circumstances neither of us controlled. That love did not diminish during our years apart, and it has certainly not diminished since finding you again. Whether or not you ever return that feeling, I could not simply stand by and watch you struggle when I possessed the means to ease your path, even in small, careful ways." Eleanor felt something shift within her chest, a wall she had maintained so carefully for so long beginning, finally, to crack under the weight of his sincerity. "I do not know what to say," she admitted softly. "You need not say anything," Alistair said. "I do not offer this declaration, seeking immediate response or obligation. I offer it simply because you deserve to know the truth of my feelings, regardless of what you choose to do with that knowledge." They sat together in comfortable, charged silence for a while longer, watching Clara sleep, the fragile beginnings of renewed trust settling gently between them, uncertain but undeniably present, like the first tentative light of dawn after a long, difficult night. Clara's recovery over the following days brought Alistair back to Prescott Lane more frequently than either he or Eleanor had initially anticipated. His visits ostensibly to check on the child's continued health, though both adults understood the deeper motivation behind his consistent presence. Eleanor found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, looking forward to these visits, the careful reserve she had maintained gradually softening into something warmer, more genuine. Clara, for her part, had taken an immediate and enthusiastic liking to Alistair, her childish directness cutting through the careful adult formalities that still governed much of the interaction between her mother and their frequent visitor. She peppered him with questions about his travels, his shipping business, and eventually, with the particular bluntness only a 7-year-old could manage, about his intentions toward her mother. "Do you love my mama?" Clara asked one afternoon, looking up from the small wooden puzzle Alistair had brought as a gift during his visit, her dark eyes studying him with unnerving directness. Eleanor, who had been preparing tea in the small adjoining kitchen area, froze at the question, waiting anxiously for Alistair's response. Alistair considered the child's question seriously, understanding that whatever he said would carry weight beyond mere polite conversation. "I do, Clara," he said honestly. "I have loved your mother for a very long time, though our paths were separated for many years before I found her again." "Are you going to marry her?" Clara pressed, with the single-minded persistence children often displayed when pursuing questions adults found uncomfortable. "That is entirely your mother's decision," Alistair said carefully, glancing toward Eleanor, who had abandoned the pretense of tea preparation and stood watching the exchange with an expression caught between embarrassment and something softer, more vulnerable. "I would be honored if she chose to accept me, but such decisions cannot be rushed, nor should they be made lightly." Clara considered this answer with evident seriousness, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "I think you should marry her," she announced decisively. "You bring nice presents, and you make Mama smile more than she used to." "Clara," Eleanor said, mortification coloring her voice, though Alistair only laughed, genuinely delighted by the child's unguarded honesty. "I appreciate your endorsement, Clara," he said solemnly, as though discussing a matter of great importance with a fellow adult. "I shall take your recommendation under careful consideration." Later that evening, After Clara had been settled for the night, Eleanor and Alistair sat together in the small parlor, the earlier conversation still hanging in the air between them, unresolved but no longer entirely avoided. "She adores you," Eleanor said softly, watching the fire flicker in the small hearth. "It has been a long time since I have seen her so animated with anyone beyond myself and Margaret." "The feeling is mutual," Alistair said. "She is remarkable, Eleanor, bright and curious, and entirely unafraid to speak her mind. You have raised her beautifully, despite everything you have faced." "I have done my best," Eleanor said, a note of exhaustion creeping into her voice despite the compliment. "Though I confess, some days it feels barely adequate. The constant worry about money, about her future, about whether I am truly providing everything she deserves." "You need not carry that worry alone," Alistair said gently, moving slightly closer on the small settee they shared. "I have told you already, Eleanor, that my feelings for you have not diminished. If anything, watching you these past weeks, watching your strength and dedication to Clara's welfare, has only deepened my admiration and affection." Eleanor turned to look at him, searching his face for any trace of insincerity, finding none. "I am afraid, Alistair," she admitted quietly, the confession costing her considerable effort. "Afraid to trust again, afraid to hope, only to have that hope shattered as it was before. I have built a careful, protected life for Clara and myself, difficult as it has been, and I fear the vulnerability of opening myself to you again, only to risk losing everything, should circumstances once more conspire against us." "I understand that fear," Alistair said. "I carry similar concerns myself, though perhaps expressed differently. I fear that my title, my wealth, the very things that should ease your burdens, might instead create distance between us, might make you doubt the sincerity of my feelings, wondering whether I offer genuine love or merely convenient rescue." "Perhaps we are both afraid of the same fundamental thing," Eleanor said slowly, considering this. "Afraid that what feels genuine and true might somehow prove false, as it did before, through circumstances beyond our control. Then perhaps," Alistair said carefully, "we might choose to move forward despite that fear, rather than allowing it to dictate our path entirely. I am not asking for immediate answers, Eleanor. I am asking only that we continue what has begun between us, that we allow ourselves the possibility of rebuilding trust gradually, without pressure or expectation, beyond what feels natural and right." Eleanor considered this proposal carefully, weighing years of accumulated caution against the growing warmth she felt whenever Alistair was present, the ease with which Clara had accepted him, the genuine kindness he had demonstrated repeatedly, through both grand gestures and small, thoughtful attentions. "I would like that," she said finally, the words emerging softer than she intended, though no less sincere for their quiet delivery. "I would like to continue this, Alistair, slowly, carefully, and see where it might lead us." Something in Alistair's expression shifted at these words, relief and joy mingling openly across his features, in a way he made no attempt to disguise. "Thank you," he said simply. "I promise you, Eleanor, whatever comes of this, I will not repeat the mistakes of the past. I will not allow anyone or anything to separate us again without a fight." Their renewed connection, though still cautious and measured, deepened steadily over the following weeks. Alistair continued his regular visits to Prescott Lane, careful never to overwhelm Eleanor with grand gestures or excessive attention, content instead to build genuine familiarity through shared conversation, through evenings spent discussing books and ideas, through gradual reintroduction to the easy companionship they had once shared, as much younger people. He met with Clara's teacher, discreetly ensuring the school received additional resources that might benefit all the children, not merely Clara alone, careful to avoid any appearance of favoritism that might complicate Eleanor's position within the small community. He continued his support of the Widows' Society, his genuine commitment to their cause extending well beyond his personal connection to Eleanor, though she remained his primary motivation for the depth of his involvement. Eleanor, in turn, found herself gradually shedding some of the protective armor she had constructed over the years of hardship and disappointment, allowing herself small moments of genuine happiness, genuine hope for a future that might hold more than mere survival and quiet endurance. She noticed herself laughing more freely, thinking less constantly about the crushing weight of financial worry, finding in Alistair's steady, patient presence a sense of security she had not experienced in longer than she cared to admit. But even as their connection deepened, both of them understood that significant obstacles remained ahead. Eleanor's financial circumstances, though somewhat eased by Alistair's careful, indirect assistance, remained precarious. Society's judgment of her situation, and the complications that might arise should her connection to a duke become publicly known, loomed as a persistent concern neither of them had yet fully addressed. And beneath it all, the question of whether 10 years of separation and hardship could truly be overcome, whether the love they had once shared could survive the weight of everything that had happened since, remained unresolved. Neither of them knew, as autumn deepened into the early chill of approaching winter, that circumstances were about to force these questions into sharp, unavoidable focus, testing the fragile trust they had begun rebuilding in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The letter arrived on a gray November morning, delivered by a stern-faced clerk who insisted on placing it directly into Eleanor's hands rather than leaving it with the landlady. Eleanor's stomach tightened the moment she recognized the seal of a debt collection agency, one she had hoped, foolishly, she would never encounter again, after settling what she believed were the last of Lord Hartley's outstanding obligations. She read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly with each word, before the full weight of its contents settled over her. A previously unknown debt, apparently overlooked during the initial settlement of her late husband's estate, had surfaced through a smaller creditor who had only recently discovered Lord Hartley's death and pursued the matter through legal channels. The sum demanded was substantial, far beyond anything Eleanor could hope to raise through her modest needlework income, and the letter's tone left little doubt that failure to satisfy the debt within a fortnight would result in the seizure of what few possessions remained in her rented rooms. Eleanor sat heavily in her single comfortable chair, the letter still clutched in her trembling hands, panic rising steadily within her chest. She had almost nothing left to sell. The sapphire brooch was already gone, along with most of the other jewelry she had inherited from her mother and received as wedding gifts. What remained were only a few sentimental items too precious to part with easily, a small collection of books that had belonged to her father, a modest silver hairbrush set, and most painfully, a gold locket containing a miniature portrait of Lord Hartley, one of the few tangible connections Clara possessed to the father she barely remembered. She thought immediately of Alistair, of his repeated offers of assistance, his gentle insistence that she need not carry every burden alone. But pride, stubborn and deeply ingrained, warred fiercely against the practical necessity of accepting his help. She had allowed him back into her life cautiously, had permitted small gestures of kindness that eased peripheral burdens, but this felt different, more direct, more fundamentally connected to her sense of independence and self-sufficiency. She spent that evening calculating and recalculating what she might raise through the sale of her remaining possessions, arriving each time at sums woefully insufficient to satisfy the debt collector's demands. The locket alone, she knew, might fetch enough to make meaningful progress toward the total, but the thought of parting with it, of erasing one of Clara's few remaining connections to her father, filled Eleanor with a grief so sharp it nearly matched the pain of Lord Hartley's original death. Margaret arrived the following morning, drawn by some instinct that something was wrong, finding Eleanor pale and exhausted, having clearly slept little the previous night. Eleanor explained the situation through barely controlled tears, the accumulated stress of years of struggle finally threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "You must tell Alistair," Margaret said firmly, once Eleanor finished her explanation. "Eleanor, this is precisely the sort of situation where accepting help does not diminish your dignity. This debt is not your failing, nor is it something you should be expected to resolve entirely alone." "I cannot ask him for money, Margaret," Eleanor said, shaking her head firmly. "It feels too much like exactly what I feared from the beginning, that our renewed connection would become defined by his wealth, rescuing me from circumstances I cannot manage myself." "Then do not ask him," Margaret said reasonably. "Simply tell him the truth of your situation, and allow him to decide how, if at all, he wishes to respond. You are not obligated to accept whatever assistance he might offer, but denying him the opportunity to know what you are facing seems needlessly proud, particularly given everything he has already demonstrated about his feelings toward you." Eleanor considered this counsel carefully, recognizing the wisdom in it even as her pride continued to resist. Eventually, Exhaustion and genuine fear for what the loss of her few remaining possessions might mean for Clara's stability overcame her reluctance, and she penned a brief note to Alistair, explaining the situation with careful, measured language that stopped short of directly requesting assistance. Alistair arrived within hours of receiving her note, his expression grave with concern, as Eleanor explained the full circumstances of the unexpected debt. He listened without interruption, his jaw tightening slightly, as she described the collector's threats, the timeline she faced, and her own desperate calculations regarding what she might manage to raise through the sale of her remaining possessions. "You will not be selling the locket," Alistair said firmly, once she finished her explanation, "nor anything else that holds genuine sentimental value for you or Clara. This debt will be settled, Eleanor, and it will be settled without requiring you to sacrifice pieces of your daughter's connection to her father." "Alistair, I cannot simply accept." "You are not accepting charity," Alistair interrupted gently, but firmly. "Consider it. If you must frame it in such terms, a loan, one you may repay, in whatever manner and time frame feels appropriate to you. Though I confess, I have no genuine expectation of repayment, beyond the satisfaction of knowing you and Clara are secure." Eleanor wanted to argue further, wanted to maintain the fierce independence that had carried her through the past 2 years of hardship, but something in Alistair's expression, the genuine care and quiet determination evident in every word, made continued resistance feel increasingly hollow, even to herself. "I do not know how to simply accept help," she admitted finally, her voice breaking slightly with the confession. "I have spent so long believing I must manage everything alone, that accepting assistance somehow diminishes my worth, my ability to provide for Clara properly." "Accepting help from someone who loves you does not diminish your strength, Eleanor," Alistair said gently. "If anything, it demonstrates a different kind of strength, the willingness to trust, to allow yourself to be supported, rather than insisting on carrying every burden entirely alone. You have proven your capability and resilience many times over these past years. Allowing me to assist with this particular crisis does not erase any of that proven strength." Eleanor felt something within her finally yield, the exhausting weight of years of solitary struggle beginning to ease slightly under the gentle but persistent pressure of Alistair's care. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will allow you to help with this, though I insist we discuss appropriate terms for repayment, whatever time frame you might consider reasonable." "We can discuss whatever terms bring you comfort," Alistair agreed, though his tone suggested he had little genuine interest in ever collecting repayment. "For now, allow me to handle the immediate crisis. I will contact the collection agency directly and ensure the matter is resolved swiftly and completely." True to his word, Alistair arranged, through his solicitor, for the debt to be satisfied within days, the transaction handled with sufficient discretion that Eleanor's name remained shielded from any public association with the settlement, beyond what was strictly necessary. The immediate crisis passed, leaving Eleanor with a profound sense of relief, mixed with complicated feelings, about the growing depth of her dependence on Alistair's generosity and care. But the resolution of the financial crisis brought with it new complications neither of them had fully anticipated. Word of the unusual circumstances surrounding the settlement, despite Alistair's careful efforts at discretion, began to circulate through certain social circles, whispered speculation about the Duke of Ashcomb's evident interest in a struggling widow of modest means growing steadily, threatening to expose their careful, private connection to public scrutiny neither of them felt prepared to navigate. Eleanor, upon learning of these growing rumors through Margaret's careful reporting, felt her earlier fears resurface with renewed intensity. Society's judgment had already proven harsh toward her following Lord Hartley's death and the revelation of his hidden debts. She could only imagine the further scrutiny and speculation that might arise should her connection to a duke become widely known, particularly given the circumstances of their reunion and the financial assistance he had provided. "They will say I am nothing more than a fortune hunter," Eleanor said anxiously to Alistair during his next visit, the growing social speculation weighing heavily on her mind. "That I deliberately sought your attention, perhaps even orchestrated our encounter at the pawn shop, knowing your position and wealth." "Let them speculate," Alistair said firmly, though he understood her concern was genuine and not easily dismissed. "I will not allow society's judgment to dictate the course of our connection, Eleanor. Whatever they choose to believe about your motivations, I know the truth, and that truth is all that ultimately matters. It is easy for you to dismiss their judgment, Eleanor said, a note of frustration entering her voice. You possess title, wealth, and standing that shields you from the worst consequences of gossip and speculation. I possess none of those protections, Alistair. Society's judgment could destroy what remains of my reputation, could affect Clara's future prospects, her ability to make a respectable match when she comes of age, her acceptance within whatever social circles she might eventually navigate. Alistair fell silent, recognizing the validity of her concerns, understanding that his own position, however complicated by the circumstances, remained fundamentally more secure than hers. The growing social speculation represented a genuine threat to Eleanor's carefully rebuilt stability, one that could not simply be dismissed or wished away through good intentions alone. "What would you have me do?" he asked finally, genuine uncertainty coloring his voice. "I cannot simply disappear from your life again, Eleanor, not after everything we have rebuilt these past months. But I also will not allow my presence to cause you further harm or hardship." Eleanor did not have an immediate answer, the competing pressures of her growing feelings for Alistair and her legitimate fears regarding social consequences, leaving her caught in an increasingly difficult position, one that would require careful, deliberate consideration before any clear path forward could be determined. The gossip reached its most damaging point at a gathering Eleanor had reluctantly agreed to attend. A modest social event hosted by one of the few remaining acquaintances from her former life, who had not entirely abandoned her following Lord Hartley's death. She had accepted the invitation, partly out of a desire to maintain what few social connections remained available to her, and partly, though she would not readily admit it, out of curiosity about whether Alistair might also attend, given his own connections within similar social circles. He did attend, arriving separately but finding her within the first half hour, the two of them exchanging careful, polite greetings that did little to disguise the warmth evident between them to anyone observing closely. And observed closely they were, Eleanor soon realized, as she caught fragments of whispered conversation, pointed glances, and the particular quality of attention that suggested she and Alistair had become the primary subject of the evening's speculation. "Lady Hartley," said a woman Eleanor recognized vaguely as a distant connection of her late husband's family, approaching with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "How fortunate you have found such a generous benefactor in the Duke of Ashcombe. Society does so love a story of rescue and redemption." The comment, delivered with poisonous sweetness, struck precisely the nerve Eleanor had feared, confirming her worst suspicions about how their connection would be perceived and discussed among those who knew nothing of the genuine history and feeling underlying their reunion. "I am not certain what you mean," Eleanor said carefully, maintaining outward composure despite the humiliation burning within her. "Come now, Lady Hartley. There is no need for false modesty among friends," the woman continued, her smile widening slightly. "Everyone has heard how the Duke settled your outstanding debts, how he has taken such a personal interest in your welfare since your unfortunate encounter at that pawn shop. Quite the fortunate turn of events for a widow in your circumstances. Wouldn't you agree?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her face, humiliation and anger warring within her as she struggled to formulate an adequate response. Before she could speak, however, Alistair appeared at her side, having overheard enough of the conversation to understand its cruel implications. "Lady Ashford," he said, addressing the woman with cool, deliberate formality, "I would advise considerable caution before speculating publicly about matters that do not concern you. Lady Hartley's circumstances, and my own personal decisions regarding charitable assistance, are private matters that warrant neither your speculation nor your commentary." Lady Ashford's smile faltered slightly, under the weight of Alistair's evident displeasure, though she recovered quickly, offering a shallow curtsy before retreating to rejoin whatever group of gossiping acquaintances had likely dispatched her to gather information. Eleanor remained standing beside Alistair, mortification still burning through her, though his defense had provided some measure of comfort against the cruelty of the encounter. "I should not have come tonight," Eleanor said quietly, once Lady Ashford had departed. "I knew this might happen, knew that society would seize upon our connection as fodder for gossip and speculation." "You have done nothing wrong, Eleanor," Alistair said firmly. "Their speculation and cruelty reflects poorly upon them, not upon you or the genuine feeling between us." It does not matter whose fault it is, Eleanor said, frustration and exhaustion evident in her voice. The damage to my reputation remains the same, regardless of the source. Alistair, I cannot continue like this, caught between genuine affection and the constant fear of social destruction. Something must change, one way or another. Alistair studied her expression carefully, recognizing the genuine distress underlying her words, understanding that the situation had reached a critical juncture that could no longer be avoided or postponed through careful, gradual progress alone. Then let us leave this gathering, he said quietly, and discuss properly what path forward might address your concerns, while preserving what has grown between us these past months. They departed shortly after, Alistair escorting Eleanor to her rented rooms, in careful silence, both of them recognizing the weight of the conversation that awaited them once they reached privacy. Clara was already asleep, watched over by a neighbor who had agreed to look after her during Eleanor's brief social outing, allowing the two adults space for the difficult conversation that could no longer be delayed. I understand your fears, Alistair said, once they were settled in the small, familiar parlor where so many of their recent conversations had taken place. I understand that society's judgment carries very real consequences for you and Clara, consequences that do not similarly threaten my own position, given the protections my title provides. Then you understand why continuing as we have been, caught in this uncertain space between friendship and something deeper, cannot continue indefinitely, Eleanor said. Every additional encounter, every kindness you extend, every moment we spend together, only deepens the speculation and gossip that threatens my reputation and Clara's future prospects. Then perhaps, Alistair said slowly, choosing his words with evident care, the solution is not to retreat from this connection, but to formalize it in a manner that removes any ambiguity, any grounds for the sort of speculation that has caused you such distress this evening. Eleanor looked at him sharply, understanding the implication behind his careful phrasing, though she said nothing immediately, waiting for him to continue. I am not suggesting this lightly, nor am I suggesting it purely as a solution to social speculation. Alistair continued, Eleanor, I have loved you for 10 years, through separation and silence, and circumstances that stole precious time from us both. I do not wish to spend further years navigating careful, ambiguous connection, always fearful of gossip and social consequence. I would rather commit fully to what exists between us, and allow that commitment to silence whatever speculation might otherwise continue to circulate. Are you suggesting marriage? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper, the question hanging heavily in the air between them. I am, Alistair confirmed, his eyes never leaving hers. I understand this may feel sudden, given the relatively brief period since our reunion, though in truth, our connection extends back a full decade, interrupted only by circumstances beyond our control. I do not offer this proposal lightly, nor do I expect an immediate answer. But I wanted you to understand that my intentions toward you extend far beyond casual affection or temporary assistance. I wish to build a genuine life together, Eleanor, one that includes Clara fully, one that offers you security and respect, rather than continued vulnerability to society's harsh judgment. Eleanor sat in stunned silence for several long moments, the weight of his words settling over her slowly, mixing with the accumulated emotions of the evening's earlier humiliation and the deeper feelings that had been steadily growing between them over the preceding months. This is a great deal to consider, she said finally, her voice unsteady with the magnitude of the decision before her. Alistair, marriage to you would change everything about my life, about Clara's future. I would become a duchess, responsible for obligations and expectations I have never been trained to navigate. I would need to consider whether I am truly prepared for such a transformation, beyond simply the question of my feelings toward you. I understand completely, Alistair said gently. I do not expect you to answer tonight, or even this week. Take whatever time you require, Eleanor, to consider this decision fully, to weigh not only your feelings toward me, but the practical realities such a significant change would bring to your life and Clara's. Thank you, Eleanor said softly, gratitude evident in her voice for his patience and understanding. I need time, Alistair, but please know that my feelings toward you have grown considerably these past months, regardless of whatever decision I ultimately reach regarding your proposal. Alistair nodded, understanding, though the uncertainty of the coming days weighed heavily upon him as he took his leave that evening. Uncertain whether the woman he had loved for a decade would ultimately choose to build a future alongside him, or whether the accumulated weight of hardship, caution, and fear of social judgment would prove too significant an obstacle to overcome. Eleanor spent the following days in careful, deliberate contemplation, turning Alistair's proposal over in her mind from every conceivable angle, weighing not only her own feelings and desires, but the practical implications such a significant decision would carry for Clara's future as well. She sought counsel from Margaret, whose steady friendship had proven invaluable throughout the preceding months, and found herself, in quieter moments, returning again and again to memories of the young man she had loved at Ashcombe, comparing them carefully against the man Alistair had become. "What troubles you most about accepting?" Margaret asked one afternoon, as the two women sat together over tea, Clara occupied nearby with a book Alistair had gifted her during one of his visits. "I fear becoming dependent again," Eleanor admitted, the confession costing her considerable effort. "I have spent 2 years learning to survive through my own resourcefulness, however difficult that survival has been. Marriage to Alistair would mean surrendering that hard-won independence, trusting entirely in his protection and provision." "Is that truly dependence, though?" Margaret asked gently. "Or is it simply partnership?" "There is a difference, Eleanor, between surrendering yourself entirely to another's control and choosing to build a shared life with someone who has demonstrated, repeatedly, genuine respect for your strength and autonomy." Eleanor considered this distinction carefully, recognizing the validity in Margaret's observation. Alistair had never once, throughout their renewed connection, attempted to diminish her capability or insist upon decisions being made without her full participation and consent. He had offered assistance, certainly, but always in ways that preserved her dignity, always accompanied by genuine respect for her judgment and autonomy. "I also fear," Eleanor continued, "that I am not equipped for the responsibilities a duchess must carry. I was raised as a doctor's daughter, Margaret, not prepared from childhood for the complex social obligations and expectations that accompany such elevated position." "You have navigated far more difficult circumstances than social obligation these past 2 years," Margaret pointed out reasonably. "You have managed poverty, grief, the challenges of raising a daughter alone with minimal resources. I have every confidence you possess the intelligence and adaptability necessary to navigate whatever social complexities marriage to a duke might present." Eleanor smiled slightly at her friend's confidence, though uncertainty continued to linger beneath the surface of her contemplation. She thought of Clara, of the transformation such a marriage would bring to her daughter's future prospects, the education and opportunities that would become available to her as the stepdaughter of a duke, opportunities entirely beyond reach given their current circumstances. She thought, too, of the growing warmth and security she felt whenever Alistair was present, the ease of their renewed conversations, the genuine tenderness with which he treated Clara, the steady, patient care he had demonstrated throughout every challenge they had faced together over the preceding months. These were not the actions of a man motivated by fleeting infatuation or convenient obligation, but rather the sustained, genuine devotion of someone who truly understood and valued her. Yet beneath these considerations lingered a deeper fear, one she found more difficult to articulate even to herself. The fear that accepting Alistair's proposal, allowing herself to fully trust and depend upon this renewed connection, left her vulnerable to a devastation far greater than anything she had previously experienced, should circumstances once again conspire to separate them, or should the depth of feeling she believed existed between them prove, ultimately, less substantial than she hoped. She decided, after days of careful contemplation, that she needed to speak with Alistair directly, to voice these fears openly rather than allowing them to fester silently, potentially poisoning whatever future they might build together. She sent word requesting his visit, and he arrived the following afternoon, his expression carefully composed, though Eleanor could sense the underlying tension, the uncertainty regarding which direction her decision might ultimately fall. "I have been considering your proposal carefully," Eleanor began, once they were settled together in the small parlor, Clara occupied with her studies in the adjoining room, "and I find myself caught between genuine desire to accept and significant fear regarding the vulnerability such acceptance would require." "Tell me your fears," Alistair said gently. "I would rather understand them fully than have you carry them silently." weighing on whatever decision you ultimately reach. Eleanor took a steadying breath, then explained, as clearly as she could articulate, her concerns regarding dependence, regarding her readiness for the social obligations of her potential new position, and finally, the deeper fear of vulnerability, of trusting fully in a connection that had once before been shattered so completely by circumstances beyond her control. Alistair listened without interruption, his expression growing progressively more thoughtful as she spoke, until finally, when she had finished, he reached for her hand, holding it gently within his own. Eleanor, I cannot promise you that circumstances will never again present challenges to whatever we build together, he said carefully. Life offers no such guarantees, regardless of title or wealth or good intention. What I can promise is this: I will never again allow silence or misunderstanding to separate us without a fight. Whatever obstacles arise, I will face them directly, honestly, and with complete transparency, rather than allowing fear or external pressure to dictate our path forward. How can I be certain of that promise? Eleanor asked, though her voice carried more genuine questioning than skepticism now. You cannot be entirely certain, Alistair admitted honestly. Trust, genuine trust, always carries an element of risk, Eleanor, a leap of faith that cannot be fully guaranteed through promises alone. What I can offer is my consistent behavior over these past months, as evidence of my character, my genuine commitment to honesty and transparency, and my willingness to demonstrate, through continued action rather than mere words, that I am worthy of the trust I am asking you to extend. Eleanor considered this response, recognizing its honesty, its refusal to offer false certainty in place of genuine commitment. And regarding my readiness for the social obligations of Duchess, she asked, I possess no training, no preparation for such a significant role. Nor did I possess perfect preparation for managing a dukedom when I inherited the title, Alistair said with a slight smile. We learn, Eleanor, through experience and genuine effort, supported by those who care for our success. I have every confidence you would navigate such obligations with the same intelligence and grace you have demonstrated throughout every challenge you have faced these past 2 years, and you would not navigate them alone. I would be beside you throughout, supporting your transition rather than expecting immediate perfection. Eleanor felt the last of her significant hesitations beginning to soften under the weight of his patient, thoughtful responses, his willingness to address her concerns directly, rather than dismissing them or offering empty reassurance in their place. There is one more matter, she said finally. Clara, whatever decision I reach must consider her welfare above all else. I need assurance that your affection for her extends beyond mere pleasant tolerance, that you would embrace her fully as your own, should we build a life together. Eleanor, Alistair said, his voice carrying unmistakable sincerity. I love Clara already, genuinely and completely. She is bright and curious and remarkably resilient, much like her mother. I would be honored, more than honored, to serve as her father, in every meaningful sense, to support her education, her future prospects, her happiness, with the same dedication I would offer any child of my own blood. Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes at this declaration, the genuine warmth and sincerity evident in every word, finally overcoming the last of her careful, protective hesitation. Then perhaps, she said softly, perhaps I am ready to consider your proposal seriously, Alistair. Perhaps the fear of vulnerability, however real, should not outweigh the genuine possibility of happiness and security you are offering Clara and myself. Alistair's expression transformed with hope and relief, though he remained carefully patient, unwilling to presume too much from her words before she had reached a final decision. Take whatever additional time you require, Eleanor. I do not wish to rush you toward a decision before you feel entirely certain. I believe, Eleanor said, a small, genuine smile beginning to form despite the lingering weight of emotion, that I have taken sufficient time already, Alistair. 10 years of separation, months of careful reconsideration since our reunion. I believe I have earned the right to trust my own judgment now, rather than continuing to second-guess a decision my heart has already reached. The following days brought careful, practical discussions between them regarding the logistics of their potential future together, though the fundamental question of Eleanor's answer remained, for now, unspoken between them, building toward a moment neither of them wished to rush, but both increasingly anticipated, with growing certainty and hope. On a cold, clear morning in early December, Alistair arrived at Prescott Lane with a request that surprised Eleanor considerably. He asked that she and Clara accompany him on a brief outing, declining to explain their destination beyond assuring her the excursion would not take more than an hour of their time. Curious despite herself, Eleanor agreed, bundling Clara warmly against the winter chill, before joining Alistair in his carriage. The carriage traveled through familiar London streets before stopping, to Eleanor's considerable surprise, outside the very pawn shop where their reunion had begun months earlier. Ernest Willoughby, the proprietor, greeted them with evident recognition, though his usual brisk manner had softened into something approaching warmth as he retrieved a small velvet box from beneath his counter. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Alistair with careful deference, "I have kept this safe, exactly as you requested." He opened the box, revealing the sapphire brooch Eleanor had sold months earlier, the very piece that had first drawn Alistair into the shop, into her life once again after 10 long years of separation. "You purchased it back," Eleanor said softly, understanding dawning as she stared at the familiar jewel, memories of that first difficult encounter flooding back with unexpected intensity. "The very day after our first meeting," Alistair confirmed. "I could not bear the thought of it passing into unfamiliar hands, given how clearly it meant something precious to you. I have kept it safe since then, waiting for the right moment to return it." Eleanor felt tears gather in her eyes, as Alistair lifted the brooch carefully from its box, holding it gently between his fingers. "This brooch belonged to my mother," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "It was among the very few pieces of genuine value she left me, and selling it that day felt like severing one of my last connections to her memory." "Then allow me to restore that connection," Alistair said gently, moving to pin the brooch carefully onto her coat, his fingers steady, despite the evident emotion he, too, was experiencing. "Consider it a small token, Eleanor, of my commitment to ensuring you never again face circumstances that force such painful sacrifices." Clara watched this exchange with evident interest, her young mind clearly working through the significance of the moment, though she remained uncharacteristically quiet, sensing perhaps that something important was unfolding between the two adults she had grown to love in her own way. "Eleanor," Alistair said, once the brooch was properly secured, taking both her hands within his own, heedless of Willoughby's curious observation from behind the counter, "I have loved you since I was 23 years old, standing beneath an oak tree at Ashcombe, making promises I fully intended to keep, promises that circumstances beyond our control prevented me from honoring for far too many years. I do not wish to spend another single day pretending that love has diminished, or that I am content with anything less than building a complete life alongside you." He knelt then, right there in the modest pawn shop where their reunion had first begun, producing from his coat pocket a small ring, elegant but understated, clearly chosen, with careful consideration of Eleanor's own preferences rather than mere ostentatious display. "Eleanor Hartley," he said, his voice steady, despite the evident depth of emotion behind his words, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you allow me to spend the remainder of my life demonstrating, through consistent action and unwavering devotion, that the love I offer is genuine, permanent, and worthy of the trust I am asking you to place in me?" Eleanor stared down at him, at the ring he offered, at the sincere hope and vulnerability evident in his expression, and felt every remaining hesitation, every lingering fear, finally dissolve completely beneath the overwhelming certainty of her own feelings. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly with the emotion of the moment. "Yes, Alistair, I will marry you." Clara, who had been watching the proceedings with growing excitement, let out a delighted exclamation, throwing her arms around both adults in an enthusiastic embrace that dissolved the solemnity of the moment into genuine, joyful laughter. Willoughby, watching from behind his counter, offered his own congratulations with unexpected warmth, clearly moved by witnessing the culmination of a story that had, in its own small way, begun within his humble shop. The following months brought significant changes to Eleanor's life, changes she navigated with the same intelligence, grace, and quiet determination she had demonstrated throughout every previous challenge. She and Alistair married in a modest but beautiful ceremony that spring, surrounded by genuine friends rather than the empty social obligations that might have accompanied a more elaborate society wedding. Margaret served as Eleanor's attendant, her steady friendship having proven invaluable throughout the entire journey from that first difficult reunion to this joyful culmination. Clara, delighted by the transformation in her circumstances, adapted quickly to her new life, embracing Alistair fully as the father figure he had promised to become, while never losing the memory and respect she maintained for the father she had briefly known before his death. Alistair, true to his word, ensured her education and future prospects reflected genuine care and investment, treating her in every meaningful sense as his own beloved daughter. Society's earlier speculation and gossip, once faced directly through the legitimacy of marriage, gradually faded into acceptance, and eventually, genuine admiration for what many came to view as an unusually devoted and successful match. Lady Ashford and others who had once whispered cruel speculation found themselves, in time, seeking invitations to events hosted by the Duke and Duchess of Ashcombe, their earlier judgment conveniently forgotten in the face of Eleanor's evident happiness and Alistair's obvious devotion. Eleanor found, in the months and years that followed, that her fears regarding dependence and lost independence had been largely unfounded. Alistair proved, consistently, to be a partner who valued her judgment and capability, who sought her genuine participation in decisions both personal and related to the management of their considerable estates, rather than expecting passive acceptance of decisions made entirely without her input. She threw herself into expanding the charitable work that had first brought her and Alistair back together, using her new position and resources to support the Widows' Society and similar organizations with a dedication and effectiveness that transformed the lives of countless other women facing circumstances she herself had once endured. Her own experience of hardship, rather than being erased by her transformed circumstances, became instead a source of genuine empathy and practical wisdom that guided her charitable efforts toward meaningful, lasting impact. On quiet evenings, when the demands of estate management and charitable obligations allowed for peaceful reflection, Eleanor and Alistair often found themselves returning, in conversation, to that first fateful encounter in Ernest Willoughby's modest pawnshop, marveling at the strange, winding path that had eventually led them back to each other after 10 years of painful separation. "Do you ever wonder," Eleanor asked one such evening, as they sat together watching Clara, now considerably older, practicing her piano lessons in the adjoining room, "what might have happened had you not walked into that shop that particular afternoon?" "I try not to dwell on such possibilities," Alistair admitted, reaching for her hand as he had done so many times since that first difficult reunion. "I prefer instead to be grateful for the path that did unfold, however painful certain portions of that journey proved to be." "As do I," Eleanor agreed softly, leaning into his familiar, comforting presence. "Though I confess, I remain endlessly grateful that you possessed the courage to step through that door, rather than simply walking past, as circumstances might easily have dictated." "I could never have walked past you, Eleanor," Alistair said simply. "Not then, not now, not in any version of circumstances I can imagine. Some connections, I believe, prove simply too significant to be denied, regardless of whatever obstacles time and circumstance might place in their path." Outside their comfortable estate, winter was beginning to settle gently over the surrounding countryside, much as it had been settling over London on that distant afternoon when Alistair had first glimpsed Eleanor through a dusty pawnshop window, recognizing instantly the woman he had never truly stopped loving, despite 10 years of painful, unnecessary separation. Their story, born from tragedy and hardship, sustained through careful rebuilding of trust and genuine commitment, had finally found its way toward the happiness both of them had once believed permanently lost to circumstances beyond their control. And in the quiet, comfortable warmth of their shared life together, surrounded by Clara's continued growth and happiness, by the genuine partnership they had built through honesty and patient devotion, Eleanor understood, with complete certainty, that she had made the right decision, all those months ago, when she had finally allowed herself to trust in love once again.